Hello, true creatives, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Jim Euchner. He is the editor-in-chief of Research Technology Management, a journal for innovation managers, and also a visiting professor at Aston University. We're going to be talking about his upcoming book, which is all about the lean startup methodologies and how these can be applied to larger organizations. Jim, it's wonderful having you here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode.
So for people who don't know about you and your work, could you just give us a very brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
Sure. So I spent my career in innovation inside large organizations. I've worked at what's now Verizon, Pitney Bowes, and most recently at Goodyear. And the focus of my work most recently has been on building new businesses that are outside the core. And it is from my experience at Pitney Bowes and Goodyear, developing and building new businesses inside corporations, and from my work with clients, that I came to sort of understand first what practices work, and then second, how do you adapt them so that they can work inside the corporate context.
And you've got a new book coming out. Can you just let us know what's that called and what's the main sort of topics that it covers?
So the book is called Lean Startup in Large Organizations, and it's subtitled Overcoming Resistance to Innovation. And the basic premise of the book is twofold. First, lean startup practices, which we can talk about, work for building new businesses, from moving from places of high uncertainty to places where you've got enough certainty where you can make a bet. And they've mostly been used in startups. When people have tried to use them in large companies, they've often run into resistances that make it impossible to really practice the full system. So this book is about what those practices are, and then how they can induce reactions or antibodies and what you do about it.
Now, we were fortunate enough to have Steve Blank on the podcast a while back to give his view on how the lean startup and lean methods worked as far as innovation goes. But when you're talking about lean startup, what does it encompass for you? What are the methods or frameworks or just mindset that makes something lean startup?
So the work that I've done builds on what Eric Ries and Steve Blank, and to some extent Alex Osterwalder, have done to create the lean startup movement. And I'm trying to take it and build on it to make it useful inside large organizations. To me, lean startup is all about learning. It's about understanding that at the start of an innovation effort, there's a whole lot that you don't know. And the biggest mistake you can make is to try to assume you know things that you don't know. So it's about getting out in the world, learning from the world about everything from your offering to the business model to how you might scale it. The basic principles are the principles of the lean startup, the lean learning loop, or what I sometimes call a business experiment, the use of a minimum viable product, but in large companies, oftentimes it's more of a prototype that's with market, with customers, but not yet launched, rather than a minimum viable product. And then the pivot and persist decision, the decision about where do we go from here. One of the hard things inside large companies is to go someplace that you didn't expect to go, and to understand how to manage that. So I call the lean learning loop, the pivot decision, the minimum viable product, those are the ways you learn. They're the how to learn. The other parts of lean startup are the what you learn. You start by learning what's the customer value proposition. That's the value hypothesis. What business model might work? That's the business hypothesis. And how you grow. That's the growth hypothesis. And each of those is different inside large corporations. You have different assets available to you. You have different constraints on you. So those are the principles. I also am a big believer in the innovation accounting, what Eric Ries calls innovation accounting, keeping track. And for innovation teams, this can really seem like needless busy work, but if you don't do it, you can't really practice the method. So the methods you probably talked with Steve Blank about are exactly these methods. I've also talked at length with Steve Blank, and it's a challenge for everybody to figure out how you make these principles work inside the corporate context.
Now, I'm sure that you experienced your own challenges during your time doing innovation at these large companies, especially Goodyear, a company that's more than 100 years old. Throughout your journey, how did you start in innovation, and how did you then see a need to try things differently in this more lean startup method?
So I've been in innovation in various phases or various types of innovation my whole career. Sometimes my early career was all about process innovation and using AI to improve operations. And then I moved into product innovation. How do you get new products out, but they fit with the business model? My most recent journey is how do you create entirely new businesses inside corporations? And what I found in my early work in this area is that people really, executives in the corporation, the business leaders, really wanted to innovate outside the core. But every time the issues were raised to the point where they were ready for big investment, there was kind of an approach avoidance. There was, well, we need more information. Can you go do that? Or this guy's not on board. Can you help bring that person on board? Or maybe we'll bet in this, but let's put our toe in the water. Or, you know, this is great, but I don't know how it fits with our big business, how it fits in with our business identity. So as I dealt with those, I started asking myself, well, why are people behaving that way? What's going on? And what can we do about it? And some of the principles in the book are about that. So for example, one of the things that you can do is to make sure that you start in the right universe. So identify opportunity spaces that matter to the company and that leverage assets of the company that give you a right to win that a startup might not have. So that's sort of a principle about the places you play. For business models, the biggest issue is people are fearful of cannibalization, that you'll create a great new business, but it will succeed by making the core business fail. And so in that situation, you need to develop business models with a keen awareness, not only of how they're affecting the new business, but what impact they're having on the core business. And if you do that, you can at least mute some of the internal antibodies. And then finally, if you're going to develop a new business inside a company where you've got a different business model, I'm really in favor of the separate but connected model, which I think originally was proposed by Govindaraj and Trimble. It's a model where the new business that you're trying to incubate is separate, but it has very defined relationships with the core. So it can leverage the assets. It can leverage, for example, at Goodyear, we leveraged the service network of the company. We leveraged the product development capability of the network. We leveraged some of the IT infrastructure that let us share customers. Those kinds of things make a huge difference in making your business differentiated. So setting it up so that's possible and that the new business isn't just smothered by the existing business is another of the practices. So those are some of the things related to, sort of the issues with identity and executive resistance, even to good ideas.
It might be useful for the listeners and viewers to get a concrete example of how this might have worked. So you mentioned within Goodyear, you started up, I think you said 5 new businesses around the world.
Yeah.
How did you approach all of those challenges you just mentioned around cannibalizing the core business and getting executive buy-in, hesitance to invest too much at the beginning? What did that actually look like, maybe with an example of one of the actual businesses that you started?
Okay, we'll talk about a business that's now called Proactive Solutions. And just to give you background, it's a business that for commercial trucks where we monitor the pressure and temperature of the tires on these 18-wheel trucks in real time, and then use predictive analytics to predict ahead of time when there might be a roadside failure due to tire problems, issues with tires. And more than 80% of the time, we could predict that days in advance. That gives you time to fix the problem before you have an expensive failure. So there were categories that were urgent, take care of it after you finish your job, and more routine maintenance. But that's the basic idea. One of the challenges with this was, the original efforts were very technocentric. They were provide the solution and then bundle it with the tire or use it as a pull to sell tires. A couple of problems with that was that it wasn't delivering value just as a technical solution. So the first step is really go do pilots with real customers, understand what the value created is, and understand how they needed to adapt to it. So the first pilots we did, we found some fleets would listen to the alerts, others would just ignore them. Well, why? That's where we learned about the need for more predictive capability and the need to integrate differently the signals, the messages with, you send it to the dispatcher versus just sending it to the driver, and you make it a more refined message. So there was a customer insight part of that. When we were doing the business models, there was a lot of internal, sort of Sturm und Drang. We're in the tire business, and we should be doing everything that's going to help us move more tires. I did have support from the European business in particular, and from people within the R&D organization to go and try it and keep track of what the measurements were. So the next step was just do an incubation, get customer feedback, learn about the profitability of the business, learn about customer reactions to it, and very importantly, learn, does it pull through tires or does it cannibalize tires? The first reaction is, if you prevent roadside failures, we're going to lose those tire sales, we're going to lose that service revenue. And so there's an obvious way you lose business. There was less obvious way you gain business. So during the incubation, we would track which customers could we get to that we didn't get before. Did they buy more of our tires or fewer of our tires? Did they use more of our service network or less of our service network? Were we creating new service revenue in doing the installation and so forth? So we tracked those things. And then when we scaled the business, we actually brought in someone from outside who had a service-oriented mindset. And he was given the purview of building that business and then expanding it. So that business started in Europe, started in Germany, ended up across Europe, moved to North America and to Latin America. And I understand they're now working in China with it as well. So that's an example, but all along the way, I actually kept a little bit of a journey, because there were ups and downs. There were, this great thing happened, then that negative thing happened, and keeping track of it sort of helps you keep your momentum. You can first make sure you're alert to what resistances might be, and second, realize that there are ways of coming out the other end.
There's probably more than one way to talk about cannibalization. One is about what happens with the end customers. So you mentioned there's a couple of probably heated debates in the company about what's this going to do to our end revenue. There's probably also this question about cannibalization of focus and resources within the company. So if you're investing in potentially retraining an entire sales force, then that's not just going to take away time that they're selling the core product. It's going to take a while to get over this change hump, to improve performance and to get up to a new level of performance. What I've seen happen in a lot of companies is, because of that, there's always differences of opinion around leadership, especially when there's different people with different interests. So there might be one leader who's sponsoring one of these new innovation initiatives, and there's quite often, in my experience, people closer to the core business who are very reticent to change anything that's working in the status quo right now.
Right.
What's your experience been there? How do you approach this concept of getting either permission or approval or resources to actually do this innovation work?
Yes, I think you've hit on a number of things that happen, and they happen universally. So you can't really, they're less an attribute of a particular culture that people might not say is innovative, and more just a natural consequence of the fact that businesses are created and then they're optimized for the business that they're in. And anything that you do that distracts from meeting the core objective, whether it's selling tires or postage meters, is going to be resisted at some level. That's the reason why you need to, at the point when you're going to incubate the business, you need to decide, how will I organize it? And how can I get everybody on the same page with respect to that? There's a lot of evidence that organizing separately and with a clear linkage to the core business is the most effective way of doing it. People have studied, and when you're doing new businesses, if you organize in that way, one statistic was with Tushman was from Michael Tushman was 90% of those succeeded. Other structures, especially for new business innovation, failed way more often than they succeeded. So there's a structural issue. At Goodyear, our partner in Europe called together his colleagues from around the globe, and we actually did a case study. It was of the New York Times digital decision, where they had to decide how tightly do we integrate the New York Times print with the online business. So it was a different enough business that people could look at it somewhat objectively. But at the end, people looked at it and they said, if we organize this as an integral part of our core, we're going to kill it. It's not going to succeed. We're going to have to, it has to grow to a certain point before we can do that. So that was a very effective practice. Before you get to the incubation stage, I think if you don't have some sort of set of dedicated resources that can do the legwork, if you don't have some sort of a framework where you can bring the business together and decide what are the right things to work on, and if you don't have some way of leveraging the resources like sales or legal or procurement or IT, and leverage them without disrupting them from their day jobs, then you'll have trouble. So part of what I talk about in the book is working with what I call the performance engine, a coin termed again by Govindarajan. How do you work with them to get stuff done? And there are, if you think about it through the lens of game theory, you start to empathize with the people. You'd probably do exactly what they did if you happened to be sitting in their seat. Once you understand that, you can start saying, how can I take away the issues that are causing them angst instead of just escalating it or trying to build a parallel function?
I think you've hit a lot of things on you've hit a lot of nails on the head there. Because one of the things that lean startup is often commented on negatively about, especially when it comes to how it gets implemented in large organizations, is a lot of startups where these lean startup principles, as case studies seem to have worked, are ones that are very founder-led, where the team at the beginning is very small and are therefore able to do a lot of the work themselves and do these pivots and change quickly. But when you get up to the scale of a large organization, and especially changing something that previously works, then quite often you need different teams with different skill sets. And a lot of innovation teams and a lot of innovation labs over the last couple of years have been shown to be quite ineffective, because you fill those labs with people that are very good at very much the front of the innovation funnel, generating ideas, getting customer insights, maybe developing an MVP. But then when it comes to doing the handover to the core business or scaling them up or validating the business model behind them, they don't have the skills necessary to do that. So when you're talking about using these lean startup methods in the concept of a large organization, how do you think either you need to look at different capabilities within teams, between teams, or handovers between these teams?
Yeah, so I think that you need some sort, if you're going to do new business innovation as opposed to an extension of your product line, I think you need a dedicated group. And I think at the front end, you need people mainly who have the design skills and prototyping skills. And those are different from the people who will build a business model. So you need to build a small cohort of people of that sort. And they need to work somewhat independently. They need to have permissions to go out and talk to customers, to show things before they're ready. They need legal clearance to do some of the stuff they do, but that's what they do. And startups don't have to worry about clearing anything with anybody. They just do, and they go where they want. They ought to have a clear opportunity space to operate in. Oftentimes companies don't give that, but at Goodyear, we had clarity around it's outside the core and it's in services, services that enhance the product. Then when you go to the next stage, which is really building the business model, I think you need entrepreneurs, basically. You need people, we hired people from a few business schools who train people to think this way. So Case Western is one of them, Dartmouth is another, that train people to think about the learning agenda as part of what they're doing. And then they need to be very comfortable with experimenting about the business model. So will the channel work? What's the willingness to pay? How much will it cost in practice? If I'm going to leverage this asset, can I do an experiment to show whether that's feasible or not feasible? So for example, at Goodyear, we were testing the concept of an eco-friendly tire, one with very high recycled content. It would be expensive to develop it. Rather than develop it, we mocked it up. We went to a few Goodyear stores. The researchers dressed up in the blue shirts, and with marketing materials as if it existed, we sold it. And either people bought it or they didn't. If they bought it, we told them it was part of a research project and we gave them a coupon for future sales. If they didn't, we just tried to understand why. What was it? We learned enough in that short 3-week experiment to know that there were no legs in that concept. It was a concept that had been developed and customers in theory liked it. When you went into the first experiment, the first unknown, you learned that they liked it, but they weren't going to pay for it. So these are, you need people who can craft experiments, who are comfortable getting out into the world, who are able to make something happen quickly, who will design it down to the simplest possible prototype so you can move quickly. Then when you get to incubation, you need people who can sell, who can manage operations. At least they have a learning orientation, but they're more of a business mentality. At Goodyear, we had people who did the upfront work, people who did the business model development, and then we worked with the business to bring in people to do the incubation phase. That's very similar, I would say, to what Gina O'Connor, who's a professor at Babson, recommends. And and I interviewed her in the next in the book. You have to have different skills in different parts, and you have to be able. Generally, some people would flow from one stage to the next, but not everybody.
The example that you gave there, I really liked. This idea of a eco-conscious tire with recycled materials, because I think a lot of people who would have suggested that idea, in their mind, the idea is excellent and it's very forward thinking. But it's very interesting that you got the feedback that the market wasn't ready for that. And that comes to another of the stages that people associate with lean startup. When you're not getting the feedback that you want to get, do you either pivot or do you kill the project and reallocate the resources somewhere else? It sounds like you decided to reallocate the resources somewhere else, which in a lot of ways in a corporate setting is a very brave thing to do. Because quite often when the wheels start turning on an idea, it can be very hard to turn off that momentum.
Yes, I think that's right. But you know, if you have a portfolio, then people expect that it's going to happen. And also, it wasn't just one experiment in that instance. There were experiments related to the supply of materials and other information that when the team looked at it, they just said, this isn't going to go. And, you know, under what circumstance might it go? could not figure it out. And so the team was diverted to other projects. But it was hard. It was especially hard on the people who had done all the work to get to that point. And some of them left and went to other parts of the business, and a few even left the company. So you end up, those are risks. The first few projects it's hardest for. After you've done it a few times, people have a better feel for what's going on. And so it's less jarring from a career perspective.
Jim, I've really enjoyed our discussion. I think if people are interested in lean startups and how it might work for their organizations, the book would be quite helpful. If people want to find out more about the book and about your work and your insights, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
I think just go to leanstartup.biz. That's where the book is cited, and it has links to my blog, and I will put some links to some papers that might be of interest to people there as well. So I do some coaching on the side. People could connect with me through that.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get that link down in the description below. Jim, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.